The mystery of the mind. Can we truly read thoughts? There are moments in life when we sense something without knowing how or why. A stranger walks into a room and we feel uneasy. A friend assures us they're fine, but something in their voice tells us otherwise. We pick up on the unspoken, the invisible threads of human emotion, woven into every gesture, every pause, every flicker of the eyes. It feels like intuition, perhaps even magic. But what if it's neither? What if the ability to understand others, to see beyond words, is simply a skill, one that can be learned? Long ago, in a land where kings ruled and whispers carried secrets through palace halls, there lived a man who could read people's minds. He had no royal blood, no divine gift, no supernatural power. In fact, he was blind. And yet, he saw more than anyone else. His wisdom was sought by rulers and peasants alike, for he had mastered a language most people never even realized existed, the silent language of the body, the face, the breath between words. One day, the most powerful man in the kingdom stood before him, troubled by a question that had haunted him for years. This man was no ordinary seeker of wisdom. He was a king, a man accustomed to knowing all, controlling all. Yet there was one truth that eluded him, a secret that even his power could not uncover. He had come to test the blind sage, to challenge his gift, but more than that, he had come in search of something deeper. As the blind man sat quietly, sensing the weight of the king's presence, the ruler finally spoke. His voice was steady, but beneath it lay something fragile, something uncertain. "Tell me," the king said, "is my wife faithful to me?" The air grew heavy with silence. The question hung between them like a blade, sharp and waiting. The courtiers, who had gathered in the hall, held their breath, their eyes shifting between the blind man and their king. No one dared to speak. But the sage did not hesitate. He did not ask for proof, did not demand details, did not rely on second-hand whispers. Instead, he smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, as if he had already seen the answer, long before the words were spoken. "Before I answer, Your Majesty," he said, "allow me to show you something. Let me teach you how to see even without eyes." The king frowned, impatient. "I did not ask for a lesson. I asked for an answer." The blind man nodded. "And an answer you shall have. But first you must understand that the truth is never spoken. It is revealed. If you wish to know what lies hidden in the hearts of others, you must first learn the language of the mind." The king was not a man easily swayed, but there was something in the sage's voice, in the certainty with which he spoke, that made him pause. He gestured for the man to continue. "Words deceive," the sage said. "Lies slip easily from the tongue, but the body never lies. A restless gaze, a trembling hand, the way one leans forward or pulls away, these are the whispers of the truth. If you learn to listen, truly listen, you will hear everything." A murmur spread through the court. Some scoffed, others leaned in, intrigued. The king, for all his doubt, found himself unable to look away. "Tell me then," he challenged, "what do my eyes say?" The sage turned his head slightly, as if sensing something in the air. "They search for certainty," he said, "yet they do not rest. They betray a man who is unsure, who has known power but not peace." The king stiffened. He had not expected such an answer, nor had he expected it to feel so true. "I who claim to read thoughts, but you cannot even see," the king said, his voice laced with challenge. The blind man simply smiled again. "I do not need to see," he said. "I need only to listen, to the pauses in your speech, the way your breath quickens when you challenge me, the tension in your voice when you speak of doubt. The truth is not in the words, Your Majesty. It is in the spaces between them." The king exhaled, something shifting in his chest, though he did not yet know what. "You are skeptical," the sage continued, "as you should be. So let me show you. Let me tell you of the 3 ways to read a person's mind, not through magic nor through tricks, but through the simple, undeniable truths written in their body, their face, their hands. Watch closely, Your Majesty, and by the end of this lesson you will never again wonder what another man is thinking." The court was silent, every eye fixed on the blind sage. Even the king, though still guarded, felt something stir within him, a curiosity, an unwilling hope. And so the lesson began. Before we continue, if you find wisdom in these ancient stories, if they bring clarity to the world around you, consider supporting this journey by subscribing to Buddhist life philosophy. Every story shared is another light in the darkness, another step toward understanding. Now let us step into the mind of the blind sage and uncover the secrets of seeing without eyes. The king watched the blind sage with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. The man had no eyes to see, yet he spoke with a certainty that unsettled him. In all his years of ruling, the king had encountered oracles and wise men, tricksters and scholars, yet none had ever claimed what this blind man had just claimed, that thoughts were not hidden, but written plainly on the body of every person, waiting to be read. The blind sage sat calmly, his presence unshaken by the weight of the king's doubt. A faint smile played on his lips, as if he had already anticipated the ruler's resistance. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "let me ask you something. When you speak to your most trusted advisor, do you not sense when he is holding something back? When a soldier swears loyalty, do you not feel even before he speaks whether his words are true? Have you not on many occasions known something in your heart before it was ever confirmed?" The king frowned. He had felt these things before, of course. He had known when a man was afraid, when a woman was lying, when an enemy at the negotiation table was merely pretending to submit. He had trusted these instincts, though he had never questioned where they came from. "The difference between you and me, Your Majesty," the blind man continued, "is that I do not rely on instinct alone. I listen, I observe. And above all, I understand that the first and most honest storyteller is the eyes." The court grew quiet. Even those who had scoffed earlier now leaned in, curiosity pulling them closer. "The eyes," the sage said, "speak in a language older than words. They reveal what the lips try to conceal. A man may tell you he is fearless, but if his gaze flickers toward the exit, he is already searching for an escape. A woman may insist she is at peace, yet if her eyes are restless, she is a prisoner of unseen worries. A liar may shape the most convincing words, but if he cannot meet your gaze, his own body betrays him." The king's grip tightened on the armrest of his throne. He had seen this before, his wife looking away when he questioned her, his generals shifting their focus when pressed too hard. He had felt the unease of conversations where words and eyes did not align. The sage turned his head slightly, as if sensing the change in the king's thoughts. "Your Majesty, you doubt my words, but I will prove them to you. I ask for nothing but your attention." At that moment, the sound of hooves echoed outside the palace walls. A commotion stirred in the distance, and within moments, a guard entered. The hall breathless. "My king," the guard said, kneeling, "we have spotted the deer you were hunting this morning. It was seen in the eastern fields." A murmur rippled through the court. The king's hunt had been interrupted earlier, the deer vanishing into the thick of the forest. He had given up the chase, but now the news reignited the fire of pursuit in his chest. The blind sage did not move, but his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Your Majesty, before you send your men, tell me, what do you seek to prove by chasing this creature?" The king turned sharply. "I do not need to prove anything. I am a hunter. The chase is my right." The sage smiled. "And yet, what if I told you that this chase is meaningless, that the deer you hunt is not the prize you believe it to be?" The court erupted in whispers. The king's jaw tensed. "You know nothing of this hunt. You did not see the deer." "No," the sage admitted. "I did not see it, but I heard it." The whispers grew louder. Some chuckled, others shook their heads. A blind man claiming to know the truth of something he had never laid eyes on? It was absurd, but the king did not laugh. Something about the blind man's certainty sent a cold thread of doubt through him. The sage's voice was steady. "The deer that passed through your fields was not an ordinary one. It was a mother, carrying life within her. If you chase it, you chase not a victory, but a loss. This is why I say the chase is meaningless." The king felt the weight of the sage's words settle over him. He had not considered such a possibility, but still he resisted. "You are guessing." "I do not guess, Your Majesty. I read. And if you do not believe me, send your men. Let them find the truth for you." The king hesitated for only a moment before turning to his commander. "Go, bring me the deer, alive." The court was silent as the commander left. The sage sat in quiet, patience, his expression unchanged. The king did not speak, though his thoughts swirled. How could the blind man have known? Time passed. The tension in the room thickened, and then the commander returned. He knelt before the king, his face troubled. "My king," he said, "the blind man was right. The deer is pregnant." A hush fell over the court. The king felt his heartbeat in his throat. The sage turned toward him, his expression calm. "Your Majesty, you see now. You saw that I did not hesitate, that I did not doubt. I did not need my eyes. I needed only to observe what others ignored. The movement of the deer's hooves, the weight in its steps, the pace of its breath, these things told me the truth, just as a man's eyes tell the truth of his heart." The king exhaled slowly, his mind reeling. The sage had not tricked him. There was no illusion, no magic, only perception, deep, unwavering perception. The blind man spoke again, his voice softer now. "You have spent your life listening to words, Your Majesty, but words lie, they twist and turn, shaped by fear, by desire, by power. If you wish to know the truth, do not listen. Look, not with your eyes alone, but with the part of you that sees beyond them." The king looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of his court. Some looked at him directly, others turned away. Some wore masks of composure, but now he wondered, what did their eyes betray? For the first time in his life, he questioned not just the words spoken to him, but the silence that lay between them. The blind sage had given him no power, no secret trick, only the knowledge that the truth had always been there waiting for him to see. The blind sage sat in perfect stillness, his presence radiating a quiet authority that unsettled the court. The revelation about the deer had left even the most skeptical among them speechless, but the king, though shaken, was not yet ready to surrender to belief. He was a man of reason, accustomed to tangible proof, and the idea that a blind man could see what others could not was a truth too foreign to accept without challenge. He leaned forward on his throne, his fingers tapping absently against the carved wood. The sage had read the truth from what could not be seen, but was it a rare stroke of intuition, a lucky guess, or something more? The king was not a man easily deceived, and if this man truly possessed wisdom beyond the reach of ordinary sight, then he would test it once more. The court was silent as the king's voice cut through the heavy air. "If you claim to see what others cannot, tell me this: can you read a person's heart by their face alone?" The sage turned his head slightly, as if sensing more than the words themselves. "A face is a map, Your Majesty. Every emotion leaves its mark. The body may deceive, but the face is an unguarded window revealing what the heart struggles to hide." The king's eyes narrowed. "Then tell me, what does my face say?" The blind man tilted his head, as if listening to something distant. "When," he finally spoke, his voice was calm but unwavering, "your face carries the weight of suspicion, but also of fear, not of me, but of a truth you are not prepared to hear. Your mouth holds the shape of questions you have not dared to ask. Your eyes, though steady, hesitate at the edges, as if always searching for something beyond reach." The court murmured, and for the first time the king felt something tighten in his chest. He had not spoken of these things, not even to himself, yet the sage had put words to an unease that had long haunted him. The blind man's voice softened, yet there was no trace of hesitation in his tone. "The heart does not always speak in words, Your Majesty. Sometimes it speaks in the set of the jaw, the flicker of the mouth, the lines drawn over years of silence. A liar may train his tongue, but his face will betray him. A faithful servant may bow deeply, but if his lips tighten, if his eyes lower in shame, his loyalty is a mask slipping from his grasp. Those who wish to deceive you will say what you wish to hear, but their faces will tell the truth they dare not utter." The king's expression darkened, but he did not look away. "If what you say is true, then tell me this: is my wife faithful to me?" A hush fell over the chamber. The question was a storm waiting to break, its weight pressing into the space between them. Some of the courtiers shifted uneasily. Others glanced at the queen, whose face remained unreadable. The sage, however, remained as still as ever. "I do not need eyes to see the answer, Your Majesty," he said at last, "but if you wish to hear it, grant me a request." The king's patience thinned. "You are in no place to demand anything from me," the sage smiled, as if the king's irritation only confirmed what he already knew. "And yet you hesitate, not because you doubt me, but because you already fear the truth." The king's jaw clenched. He would not be made a fool in his own court. "Speak then, what is your request?" The sage inclined his head. "Allow me to be alone with your queen for a moment. No guards, no court. Only then will I give you your answer." The tension in the room thickened. The king's hand twitched toward the hilt of his sword, and the courtiers exchanged nervous glances. The queen's expression did not change, but for the briefest moment something flickered in her eyes, an emotion too fleeting to name. The king studied her, searching for hesitation, for defiance, for anything that might betray what lay beneath her calm exterior. But she did not look at him. "Very well," the king said at last. "You shall have your moment, but if you deceive me, you will not leave this chamber alive." The blind sage did not flinch. "I do not fear truth, Your Majesty. The question is, do you?" The chamber emptied, the heavy doors closing behind them. Only the blind man and the queen remained, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. She took a step forward. "What trick is this?" "No trick," the sage said. "Only an invitation." "An invitation?" she scoffed. "To what?" "To reveal what your face already knows." Her breath hitched, just barely. But it was enough. The sage did not need sight to perceive. The way her shoulders tensed, the way her lips parted as if caught between denial and confession. "You have carried a secret, my queen," he said softly. "You have worn it well, but even the most skilled liar cannot keep the face from cracking beneath the weight of what it hides." Her hands clenched. "You do not know me, but I know the language." "Of the face," he murmured. "I know that your lips tremble when you swallow words meant to be spoken. I know that your brows knit, not in concern for your king, but in fear of what is to come. And I know that even now, as you stand before a blind man, you wish you could hide." A sharp breath escaped her, and for the first time she looked away, not in anger but in surrender. When the doors opened once more, the king sat waiting, his eyes burning with unspoken demand. The sage stepped forward, his voice steady. "Your Majesty, the answer you seek is one you already know. Your wife may speak words of loyalty, but her face has already told the truth." The king turned to the queen. He did not need to ask. He could see it now, what had been there all along, written in the faintest shifts of her expression, in the way she held herself as though bracing for a storm. His fingers loosened on the hilt of his sword. The blind man's words echoed in his mind. The heart does not always speak in words. For the first time he understood. The chamber was thick with silence. The queen had not spoken, yet everything had been said. The truth had unraveled before the court, not in words, but in the way her face had faltered, in the way her eyes had searched for escape. The king, for all his power, had been blind to it until now, and as the weight of realization settled on him, he felt something unexpected, not just anger, but a quiet, gnawing grief. The blind sage had exposed what had been hidden in plain sight, and yet he remained unmoved, as though this moment had been inevitable. The king turned to him, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You have seen what I could not, and now I understand how. But tell me this, wise one, what if the face still deceives? What if a man has trained himself to wear masks so well that even his eyes betray nothing? Then how do we know the truth?" The sage inclined his head slightly, as if considering the question, though the answer had already formed in his mind. "Your Majesty, the eyes may look away and the face may lie, but the body never does." The king's gaze darkened with something unreadable. "Then prove it." The sage did not hesitate. "Bring me the man you trust most in this court. A man who would never betray you." A murmur swept through the hall. The king's advisers exchanged uncertain glances. And then, after a moment's pause, the king lifted his hand, gesturing to the captain of his guard. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward, his posture rigid with loyalty. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, but there was no aggression in the gesture, only the silent assurance of a protector standing before his king. "This man has fought by my side in battle," the king said. "He has bled for me, killed for me, and stood watch over my life for years. If you claim the body does not lie, then tell me, blind sage, what does his body say to you now?" The sage stood motionless, his presence unshaken. He did not need to see the captain's face nor hear the words he had spoken over the years in devotion to his king. He needed only to listen to what was unspoken, to what the body revealed without permission. "You stand tall," the sage said, his voice even. "Your shoulders are squared, your chest steady, your grip on your sword light but ready. These are the signs of a warrior, a man accustomed to command and duty. But I hear something else, something beneath the surface." The captain's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. "Your breath, Captain," the sage continued, "is slower now than it should be. Not the steady breath of a man at ease, nor the quickened pace of a man preparing for battle. It is controlled, too controlled, as though you are forcing yourself to be still." A flicker of unease passed through the court. The sage's voice remained calm, yet there was an undeniable weight to his words. "Your left hand, Captain, rests upon your sword, but your fingers are not relaxed. They press slightly against the hilt, as though bracing for the moment you may need to act." The king's expression was unreadable, but his eyes had sharpened. He too had begun to see what he had once overlooked. The sage tilted his head slightly, listening. "And your feet, they do not betray the stance of a man standing at ease before his king. No, Captain, your weight is ever so slightly shifted, balanced in a way that would allow you to move, fast, should the moment demand it. You stand not as a man merely loyal, but as a man prepared." The tension in the chamber thickened. The captain's fingers twitched against his sword, so slight a movement that most would have missed it. But the king did not miss it now. "You say, you are loyal," the sage said, his voice softer now but no less piercing. "And perhaps you are. But your body knows something you do not dare to admit, even to yourself. It knows hesitation. It knows the weight of secrets. And it knows the burden of standing before a man you may one day be forced to betray." A cold stillness settled over the room. The captain's breath, once controlled, now faltered ever so slightly. The king did not move, but his voice, when he spoke, was quiet and edged with something dangerous. "Tell me, Captain, if I were to fall in battle tomorrow, would your loyalty still stand, or would it shift with the changing tide?" The captain did not answer at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "My loyalty has always been to the throne, my king." It was not a betrayal, not in the way the king had feared, but it was not the answer of a man who served out of love either. It was the answer of a man bound by duty, a man who had sworn loyalty not to the person but to the power, and that perhaps was the greatest betrayal of all. The king looked at the sage, something unreadable in his gaze. "You knew this before." "I did." "I did not know," the sage said simply. "I only listened. The body speaks long before the lips do." The king turned back to his captain, searching the man's face, the way his stance had shifted, the way his fingers had finally released their grip on the sword. Had the captain ever been disloyal? No. But had the king misjudged the nature of that loyalty? Yes. And he wondered then how many other men in his court carried that same truth in the way they stood, in the way their hands twitched, in the way their feet angled ever so slightly toward the door. The blind sage had not only revealed a lesson, he had shattered something the king had once believed to be unshakable. The sage exhaled softly. "You have spent your life listening to the words of men, your majesty, but men do not always speak their truths. Their bodies, however, always do. If you wish to know who is truly loyal, who truly loves, who truly fears, do not listen to their words. Watch how they stand before you. Watch how they move when they think no one sees. That is where the truth has always been waiting." The king sat in silence, and for the first time in his reign he truly saw. The great hall was silent. The weight of the blind sage's words lingered in the air, pressing down on the king like an unseen force. The truths revealed that day had shaken him, not because they were complex, but because they had been so painfully simple. The eyes, the face, the body, none of them had ever lied. It had always been there, right in front of him. He had simply never learned how to see. He sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his throne. His mind drifted back to the years he had spent believing in words. He had listened to oaths of loyalty, to declarations of love, to voices that promised and swore and reassured. And yet how many of those words had been empty? How many had contradicted the truth written in restless hands, in fleeting glances, in quiet, involuntary gestures? His captain of the guard had not betrayed him, not in action, but his body had carried a truth the king had not wanted to acknowledge, that loyalty to the throne and loyalty to the man who sat upon it were not always the same. His queen had not needed to confess her unfaithfulness. Her face had done it for her. His advisers, his courtiers, even his closest friends, how many of them had spoken with their bodies while he remained deaf to their silent language? The blind sage sat across from him, his face serene, unburdened by the weight of the revelations he had delivered. The king studied him, for once not seeking to challenge or test, but to understand. "You have shown me much," the king said at last, his voice quieter than before. "You have taught me to listen, to observe. But tell me, if all these truths have been there all along, why did I fail to see them?" The sage smiled, as though he had been waiting for this question. "Because, Your Majesty, you have spent your life searching for answers outside of yourself. But the mind, when restless, cannot see clearly. It hears what it wants to hear, believes what it wants to believe. It looks at a man's eyes, but does not question why they flicker away. It listens to a woman's voice, but does not hear the hesitation beneath her words. It accepts the stillness of a soldier, but does not feel the tension in his stance." The king's throat tightened. How often had he done this? How often had he mistaken silence for loyalty, stillness for peace? The sage's voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of something ancient, something true. "The final lesson, Your Majesty, is the hardest of all. To read others, you must first read yourself. To hear the unspoken, you must quiet the noise within your own mind. Truth is like a reflection in water. When the surface is disturbed, the image is broken. Only when it is still can the truth be seen clearly." The king felt something stir in his chest, something unfamiliar yet strangely peaceful. "Then tell me," he said, "how does one quiet the mind?" The sage's expression did not change. He simply let the silence stretch between them, unbroken. At first, the king waited, expecting an answer. When none came, he felt irritation flicker within him. Was this some trick, some test? He was a man who commanded answers, yet here was a man who simply sat in silence, offering none. The longer the silence stretched, the more the irritation softened, turning into something else, awareness. He became aware of the faint rustle of fabric as the courtiers shifted in their seats. He became aware of his own breath, steady yet shallow. He became aware of the way his own fingers curled slightly against the wood of his throne, a tension he had never noticed before. And then, in that stillness, the answer revealed itself. Silence was not empty. It was full. It carried the weight of things unsaid, of truths unspoken. It was the space where the mind could finally listen, not just to others, but to itself. The blind sage finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the secret. Your Majesty, not to think, not to seek, not to fight for understanding, but to simply be still. In stillness, the truth comes forward on its own." The king did not speak. He did not need to. For the first time in his life, he understood. The court remained quiet, watching their king. They expected him to challenge the sage, to press further, to demand something more. But he did none of those things. He simply sat there, his hands resting lightly, his breath slower than before, his gaze unfocused, as if seeing something far beyond the great hall. When he finally rose, his steps were measured, unhurried. He walked to the blind sage and stood before him, not as a king demanding wisdom, but as a student who had finally learned to listen. "You have given me sight," he said, "not with my eyes, but with my mind." The sage smiled, as though this too had been inevitable. The king turned to his court, scanning the faces of the men and women he had once thought he knew. Their bodies, their expressions, their stillness, everything spoke to him now in a language he had never understood before. He did not need to ask who was truly loyal. He could see it. He did not need to question who feared him. He could feel it, and for the first time, he did not need words to understand the world around him. The blind sage bowed his head. "The greatest wisdom, Your Majesty, is not found in seeking more. It is found in learning to be still enough to see what has always been there." The king let the words settle within him. He did not need to say anything in return. The lesson had already been learned. As the court watched in stunned silence, the king simply turned and walked away. His step steady, his mind quiet, his sight clearer than it had ever been before. The king walked through the quiet halls of his palace, his mind unburdened in a way it had never been before. The weight of uncertainty, the endless questioning, the blind reliance on words, all of it had faded into something simpler, something clearer. He no longer needed spoken answers, no longer sought reassurance in promises. He could see the truth now, not with his eyes but with the awareness he had gained. He thought of his queen, of the way her face had betrayed what her lips refused to say. He thought of his captain, of the tension in his stance, of the quiet truth that his loyalty lay not with the man, but with the throne itself. He thought of every conversation he had ever had, every decision he had ever made, all based on words, so many of which had been lies. And then he thought of the blind sage, the man who had given him a gift far greater than sight. He had not taught the king magic, nor had he given him a power beyond ordinary men. He had simply shown him how to listen, how to observe, how to be still. The greatest truths, the king now understood, were never spoken. They were found in the silence between words, in the flicker of a gaze, in the way a hand curled into a fist before a lie was spoken. The body never lied, the face always revealed, and the eyes, they carried the unfiltered truth of a person's soul. As he stood before the grand windows of his palace, overlooking the vast kingdom below, he no longer felt the need to ask questions. He once feared had no answers. The answers had always been there, waiting to be seen. And now he would rule not with the words of others, but with the silent knowledge he had gained. The blind sage had long since left, but his lessons remained, woven into the very fabric of the king's being. In life, we often rely on words to tell us the truth. We listen to what people say, believing that if they speak it, it must be real. But how often have words deceived us? How many times have we trusted someone, only to find out later that their promises were empty? The truth is, people reveal themselves in ways they do not realize. A restless glance, a tightening of the jaw, a hesitant step backward. These are the whispers of the mind, the silent language that speaks louder than any voice. If we learn to observe, if we learn to be present, if we learn to listen with more than just our ears, we will begin to understand others in a way that words alone could never provide. We will know when someone is lying, when they are afraid, when they are hiding something they cannot bring themselves to say. But the most important lesson is this: to read others, we must first learn to quiet our own minds. A mind that is restless, consumed by doubt and distraction, cannot see clearly. Only when we learn to be still, to exist in the present, can we truly perceive what has been in front of us all along. The king had spent his life searching for certainty in words, but in the end he found it in silence, and perhaps so can we. If this story has resonated with you, if these lessons have offered a new way of seeing the world, consider supporting Buddhist life philosophy. Your presence, your engagement, and your curiosity allow us to continue sharing wisdom that has guided generations before us and will continue to illuminate the path ahead. May we all learn to see, not just with our eyes, but with our understanding.